Hello, I'm Shihoko Goto, Acting Director of the Asia Program and Director for Geoeconomics at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for joining us today. As you may know, the Wilson Center was established in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, and the only US president with a PhD to date. He is also best remembered for proposing the League of Nations after World War I, which became the foundation of the United Nations. Wilson's commitment to a world community for peace is particularly relevant for today's discussion regarding Taiwan's international standing. Now, of course, China exerting pressure over Taiwan is nothing new. But in addition to intensifying military activities, economic coercion, disinformation campaigns to destabilize Taiwan from within, Beijing is also stepping up efforts to exclude Taiwan from the international community at large, including the United Nations. The PRC's campaign to legitimize its claims to Taiwan within the framework of international law has been intensifying. And meanwhile, Taiwan's unique legal status, the fact that Taiwan's standing under international law remains unresolved, makes it vulnerable amid China's heightened push to assert its claims over the island. Here to discuss Taiwan's international engagement is Yu-Jie Chien, Assistant Research Professor at Taipei's Academia Sinica. She's also a non-resident affiliated scholar with the U.S. Asia Law Institute at New York University School of Law. I'm also very happy to say that Yu-Jie is also the visiting Taiwan Scholar of the Wilson Center's Asia Program for 2023. And it's been really great having her join us at the center this summer. Here with me also is Bonnie Glaser, who really needs no introduction for those of us focused on US-Taiwan relations. Bonnie is, of course, the managing director of the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund. She is also a non-resident fellow of the Lowy Institute and co-author of the book, US-Taiwan Relations, Will China's Challenge Lead to a Crisis, released earlier this year. So with that, Yu-Jie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shihoko. I'm very delighted to be here, and many thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting me. This opportunity to engage with various viewpoints in DC has been invaluable to me and enables me to complete my policy brief on this research. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will highlight my research findings, including how Beijing has escalated legal narratives to exclude Taiwan from the international system, how international organizations have been misguided in this respect, and how Taiwan can work with partners to break through such isolation. I'll then share my conclusion and recommendations towards the end. So first of all, China's legal narrative to internationalize its One China principle. We all know that Taiwan has long been excluded from numerous international organizations, but since 2016, after Taiwan's DPP assumed power, China has resorted to various coercive measures to pressure Taiwan's government to accept Beijing's One China principle, which claims that Taiwan is part of China. China, among the tactics, has actively pursued an international agenda aimed at globalizing its sovereign claim on Taiwan. Although the question of Taiwan's status remains far from settled, Beijing claims that its One China principle, including its sovereign claim over Taiwan, is, quote, a general consensus of the international community, unquote. This strategy of Beijing's appears to aspire to align its One China principle with what international law refers to general principles of law. The combination of this misleading narrative with Taiwan's limited access to key international institutions for conflict resolution can contribute to Beijing's portrayal of any potential conflict across the Taiwan Strait as internal walls, quote unquote, or in Chinese terms, 内战, rather than an invasion to annex Taiwan. This, of course, should be of concern to countries that share the goal of maintaining peace across the Taiwan Strait. In the next section, I would like to disentangle the question of China's representation from questions of Taiwan's representation and sovereignty. So Beijing, beyond asserting the One China principle represents an international consensus, it has focused its campaign on the UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, made in 1971. And Beijing has misrepresented it as synonymous with Beijing's claim of owning Taiwan. But invoking this 1971 resolution to preclude discussions concerning Taiwan's status and block Taiwan's international space is misleading. An excellent German Marshall Fund report published last year by Jessica Drun and Arbani here has thoroughly analyzed this issue. Essentially, UNGA Resolution 2751 was about Chinese representation, and all the similar resolutions in UN specialized agency addressed only this question and not the questions of Taiwan's sovereignty and Taiwan's representation. So it is indefensible to argue that a resolution solely on China's representation definitely settles issues related to Taiwan's status and representation. Moreover, we should keep in mind that the UNGA has no legal authority to serve as the ultimate arbiter of Taiwan's statehood under international law. Next, I want to talk about practices of international organizations that have been misguided about Taiwan. So China's consistent efforts to misconstrue international resolutions can indeed have an effect of misguiding international organization. My policy brief discusses controversial legal views expressed in internal memorandums within the UN, as well as an undisclosed memorandum of understanding concluded between China and the WHO Secretariat. So these documents looked at together, they are based on a misunderstanding of the UNGA resolution, and then go on to say that Taiwan should be referred to as Taiwan, a province of China, and would not accept the passport holders of Taiwan to enter the UN sessions. So they are done apparently without any consent or knowledge of member states. They also underscore the necessity for transparency and accountability in international organizations. I want to say Taiwan's international engagement should not be viewed as an internal affair of the PRC, but rather it's a matter of global concern. In an ideal world, Taiwan would fully participate in the international system, but current political reality warrants a more pragmatic approach. In other words, as long as full participation is not possible, Taiwan should seek meaningful connections with the international community to highlight its cooperation without necessitating explicit state recognition. Moreover, Taiwan should seek a rule-based approach. That is to say, Taiwan's meaningful participation can and should be legally grounded within each organization's specific charter and procedural rules. My brief lays out relevant regulations and rules of procedure for a variety of international organizations for Taiwan to pursue. What I like to emphasize here is that there's room for international organizations to accept Taiwan's meaningful participation based on their own rules. Taiwan should rely on these normative bases rather than on Beijing's approval. Last, I would like to highlight the need to seek alternative pathways for amplifying Taiwan's global contributions. While it's undoubtedly critical to maintain support for Taiwan in the existing legal system, it's equally imperative to explore innovative avenues that can work in tandem of the current international regime. An outstanding illustration of such an approach is the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, GCTF. This was established in 2015 by Taiwan and the United States. The initiative aims to enable Taiwan to share its best practices. The GCTF is principally dedicated to meaningful, substantive exchanges and cooperations between experts from Taiwan and their counterparts in the United States and other countries. Since 2015, the framework has expanded in terms of partners, now including Japan and Australia, plus the United States, and also in terms of issues of collaboration encompassing a wide range of fields, including public health, humanitarian assistance, and media literacy, just to name a few. The success of this framework relies on its commitment to professionalism and practicality, because the issues discussed are often seen as less politically sensitive. They mitigate potential apprehensions among the countries involved. The GCTF has now matured into a multilateral platform, allowing all partners, including Taiwan, to actively engage with each other. Finally, I would like to close my presentation with my conclusion and recommendations. First is on Taiwan's global role and approach. I think despite its isolation from many IOs, Taiwan must maintain its commitment to a rule-based international order and seek to undertake international obligations as a responsible member, investing the necessary resources and designating an appropriate budget for key areas such as human rights compliance, international aid provisions, and climate change mitigation. In terms of IO's practices, I think it's significant for IOs to recognize their legitimacy rests on their commitment to good governance principles, including transparency and accountability. In handling the relationship between China and Taiwan, international organizations must act within the bounds of their specified mandates. Any secret agreements with China or uncritical acceptance of China's claim over Taiwan should be examined. Third, I think it's also important to continue to counter Beijing's misleading campaigns. Beijing's efforts to distort the resolution on China's representation in order to limit Taiwan's international role must be confronted both in private and in public forums, given that this has great implications for good global governance and maintaining peace across the Taiwan Strait. And this will require not only the United States effort, but a collective action by a broad coalition. So the United States and like-minded partners play a vital role in providing visible, consistent, and credible support to Taiwan. this cannot be single-handedly achieved by any country. It should be a collective action and directed not just helping Taiwan, but towards placing principled individuals committed to upholding the integrity of international institutions, generally speaking. And this approach will not only benefit Taiwan, but benefit a lot of the stakeholders in an international system. Finally, I want to emphasize this exciting part of my research, which is about innovative thinking out of the box approach for Taiwan's global presence. I've mentioned GCTF serving as an alternative model for Taiwan. I think it's important to think that initiatives such as this, with more flexibility and creativity, will allow Taiwan to establish itself as a valuable actor in the international community without the constraints of Beijing. In conclusion, I cannot emphasize enough the vital significance of adhering to a consistent, principled approach, not only for Taiwan, but also for all stakeholders involved. This is not merely a strategy, it's a commitment to values, to a future where cooperation and mutual respect guide our way forward. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Yu-Jie. You've laid a great deal on the table, but one of the most striking comments you made that resonated with me was about China's efforts to preempt Taiwan's international engagement. It's not simply an internal PRC Taiwan issue, but it is of concern to the broader international community. I'd like to turn to Bonnie. Your thoughts on what Yu-Jie had to say.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and especially to Yu-Jie for working on what is a very important issue. And as Jessica Drun and I did our research in a report that I appreciate her mentioning, and you can find on the German Marshall Fund's website on how China has distorted the resolution initially from 1971 that enabled the PRC to join the United Nations, and that's of course Resolution 2758. But the legal aspect of this issue is I think really important to explore. So let me just make a few points. One is that I always encourage people to read Resolution 2758. It's really quite short. It's just a few paragraphs. And it simply says that the seat, the China seat in the United Nations, is awarded to the People's Republic of China. There is a mention of expelling Chiang Kai-shek's forces, but there is actually no mention of Taiwan. And that resolution is silent on the issue of what Taiwan's potential participation could be in the United Nations. And it's really quite telling in the research that Jessica Drun and I did that we found that at the time, Prime Minister Zhou Enlai in Beijing said that if Resolution 2758 passed, the status of Taiwan is not yet decided. So at the time, the People's Republic of China understood that this was an issue that was being set aside, and that the resolution itself did not decide or determine Taiwan's status. My second point that I'd like to make is that China's position really has evolved over time. So if you start from 1971, the position I've just described, and fast forward to today, you'll see that this is an issue now in which China has a very different position. And I'm going to read just one sentence from the white paper on Taiwan which of course was issued in 2022, I believe in August. And that paper says, Resolution 2758 is a political document encapsulating the One China principle, whose legal authority leaves no room for doubt and has been acknowledged worldwide. Taiwan does not have any ground, reason, or right to join the UN or any other international organization whose membership is confined to sovereign states. So that's the quote from Beijing's white paper. There is, of course, no evidence that the One China principle has been embraced by all UN members. And the Secretariat of the United Nations, which Yu-Jie makes this point quite clear in her policy brief, does not have the authority to say what all the member states' positions are on the issue of One China. And it's complicated by the fact that so many countries have different policies. Yes, of course, there are countries who accept Beijing's definition of the One China principle, but most of the developed world does not. Countries in Europe, of course, the United States, Australia, Japan, all have different versions of the One China policy. And in fact, I would say that their policies differ to some extent, and that makes it difficult for them to cooperate and reach consensus on how to act on this issue, because One China policies just vary from one country to the next. The United States opposes the PRC's attempt to redefine UN Resolution 2758, and it has pushed back against UN statements claiming that Taiwan is a province of the People's Republic of China. And again, something we included in our report last year was the 2007 non-paper. And this was something that was written by the US government, the Bush administration at the time, that was presented to the United Nations, and then it was subsequently leaked. And it was originally published in a Heritage Foundation report. And that non-paper asserted the US position that Taiwan's status is not yet determined. Another point that I'd like to make, which we highlighted in our GMF report, is that China has gone back and revised documents in its archive, which is, I'm sure, illegal and probably unprecedented in the United Nations. So these are not PRC documents, they are UN historical documents. And in our report, we have screenshots of original documents that show the word Taiwan, and then we show updated documents that show that Taiwan has been changed to Taiwan Province of China. And one such instance was found in a 2014 report from the ICT, the Information and Communications Technology Study Group. It was a report on disaster relief. No, that was an ITU report, ITU report on disaster relief. And then there was another ICT report, the Information Communications Technology Study Group, which was from 2000. And both of these reports show that Taiwan was changed to Taiwan Province of China. And so the last point that I'd just like to make is why this is happening. And it's clear that to some extent, China is pushing on an open door. The United Nations itself does not want to have a confrontation with China. China gives a lot of money, of course, to the UN, particularly for UN peacekeeping operations. And China has many senior people in positions at the head of agencies or the deputy director level at agencies. So over time, China's influence has increased substantially. So the United Nations, I think, doesn't want to pick a fight. And the member states themselves, as I said, do not really agree on how to address this issue. And I believe that the United States is the only country whose officials have publicly stated that they oppose this Beijing's interpretation of UN Resolution 2758. And I recall that I did an event sometime earlier in the Biden administration. I think it was in 2021, and then Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Rick Waters was in that conversation and stated clearly that the United States does not accept this interpretation of the One China principle having been accepted by the UN. So I think what's really necessary is for like-minded countries to get together and determine a course of action in the United Nations. They can certainly meet with the UN Secretary General. They can write letters, and they can initiate actions to try and reverse this distortion of UN Resolution 2758 in the United Nations, and perhaps open the door to greater participation by Taiwan in the future. There is, I think, growing support. We saw this, of course, during COVID-19, especially. There's growing support for Taiwan returning to its observership status in the World Health Assembly. That's probably a top priority, but there is also a good case to be made at the International Civil Aviation Organization and in perhaps other agencies that are in the United Nations. And Yu-Jie, of course, addresses some of these issues in her policy brief. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Yu-Jie, for working on this very important issue.
And that's fantastic. Thank you, Bonnie, for your insight. Yu-Jie, before I just turn it over for you to respond to Bonnie, one of the issues that I really wanted to ask you, following up on what Bonnie had to say, was about the evolution of China's position regarding Resolution 2758. You and I have had conversations before about how your own research has been impacted, meeting and working with your counterparts, the legal scholars in China. I'm hoping you could expand a little bit more about that evolution.
Thank you, Shihoko, and thank you to Bonnie for your wonderful comments. I think they're all right on point. So to respond to Shihoko's question about my own research experience and what I've seen in China's legal academia, definitely not just on Taiwan questions, but on a lot of issues that are considered politically sensitive by the Chinese government are now hard to discuss with my Chinese counterparts. And it's also become very difficult, very challenging to visit China for a lot of scholars who have to consider what are the benefits of such a trip if there is very limited exchange to begin with. Because I think right now the political atmosphere, the academic atmosphere in China is just not as liberal as, say, 15 years ago when I first studied Chinese law. And so it's, of course, understandably frustrating for outsiders who are trying to understand the local views in academia, in the government, because such exchanges are often restricted or even just prevented from happening. In terms of the more grand narrative from the Chinese government, I do see that on Taiwan, it's getting tougher, harsher, as a lot of different coercive measures have been launched against Taiwan's DPP government. We all know about the military exercise, but there are, what I'm trying to point out in the policy brief is a more, I think, underappreciated aspect of China's coercive measure, which is use a legal narrative to continue to isolate Taiwan, even though support for Taiwan's international role has gradually, slowly increasing among like-minded democracies. So I think democracies have a lot to catch up on China's increased, in terms of China's increased pressures, because I at this point we don't see any feasibility in terms of countering China's influences in international organizations. But I'm not saying that this cannot be done. I'm saying that this will require us to understand that immediate benefits may not be visible in the foreseeable future, but we need to continue this approach of being consistent, being credible to partners, building Taiwan as a trustworthy partner to work with for other stakeholders who are understandably reluctant to cooperate with Taiwan. But one of the things for them to understand working with Taiwan would be beneficial and would be principle is to think of ways for them to start really connecting with Taiwan to begin with. So GCTF in my brief plays an important part that I highlight in my brief is to break through the current constraints and to allow Taiwan to really show that it's not about politics. Taiwan's help or Taiwan's contributions to the world can be meaningful and genuine and substantive. So I'm advocating for a more pragmatic approach for Taiwan and other partners in the framework to pursue all together. And I think with this, over time, countries will gradually see the value of including Taiwan. And I understand what Bonnie was saying about various versions, differences in terms of each country's one China policies. And what I'm saying is that including Taiwan's meaningful participation does not necessitate the recognition of Taiwan's statehood. And I think this probably is the denominator that all countries may be able to get on board and say, yes, we welcome Taiwan's meaningful participation, and we are against China's distortion of such a resolution simply on the question of China's representation to exclude completely, entirely Taiwan's participation. So this is what I'm advocating for in my policy brief.
Thank you. So you highlight GCTF as one good model to ensure that there is greater engagement of Taiwan, and it is not necessarily focused on it is not a political action. It is not actually taking a stance regarding Taiwan vis-a-vis China, but it is a forum for greater international cooperation and coordination on issues of mutual interest. Of course, Taiwan is a member of some key international organizations already, such as the WTO, which comes under the UN framework umbrella, and Apec as well. I'm wondering if you could elaborate if there's greater opportunity for Taiwan to participate in those existing institutions that it is already a member in.
So yes, I do think it's there are some precedents for us to look at in terms of thinking about broadening Taiwan's participation. WTO and Apec are both good examples. They allow Taiwan to take part in the organization and the forum, but without recognizing explicitly Taiwan's statehood, and that solves the problem. And of course, Taiwan has to use very particular monikers, such as custom territories or Chinese Taipei, the names that would not implicitly indicate the Taiwan's status as a state, but I think this physical and pragmatic approach is now something that is feasible and would be supported by a broader coalition than an approach that where Taiwan insists on its statehood. But we also have to keep in mind that these precedents happened because back in the days, China was not as forceful and assertive in terms of insisting on its position. And so with a broader coalition supporting Taiwan at the time, Taiwan was able to say, for example, in the WTO instance, be allowed to enter the organization right after China was admitted. So that was a precedent that was made possible by all countries involved in that organization, insisting that the WTO regime cannot do without Taiwan's role. And therefore, a special arrangement was made to both allow China and Taiwan. And of course, we need more of these examples where a lot of the stakeholders would understand the value of including Taiwan, and they would use alternative ways to both admit China and Taiwan. China and Taiwan can coexist peacefully in an organization and in a lot of international organizations, and that would be good for Taiwan and the global governance, as well as the peace and security across the Taiwan Strait. And I do think we need more. We have a lot of convincing and persuasion to do to allow to not just allow like-minded democracies understand, but also to have deepened level of knowledge and understanding in international organizations about this position, about where's room and where's probably not a lot of room in order to advocate for Taiwan's participation. And a lot of the issues really concern about, more broadly, what should we expect of international organizations? I do think IOs have a lot of reflection to do in terms of their conduct, their behavior, their practice when it comes to Taiwan. They have to adhere to their own principles, and that's principles under rule of law regimes, very fundamental principles of accountability and transparency. So, of course, we do not want to see leadership in international organizations to enter covert agreements with China that would preclude Taiwan's participation without even consulting with member states, and even in violation of the resolution made by member states that was not intended to exclude Taiwan's participation. So I do think that international organizations, we should think about more generally just the integrity of global governance and what roles will we expect of these organizations to do.
Great. Bonnie, I think your thoughts?
Well, since you mentioned Apec, I should just highlight that, of course, that the United States is the host of the Leaders Summit this year. So we will see in November in San Francisco, probably Xi Jinping will come and all of the other leaders. And usually Xi Jinping actually at the Apec summit meets with the representative from Taiwan, who is sent basically as a special envoy of Taiwan's president. In the past, that has been Morris Chang, the first CEO of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, TSMC. We don't know who will be representing Taiwan this year. It will not be Taiwan's president, but it could be someone else. But I do think that this is an opportunity to further highlight Taiwan's participation, which most members of APEC really do welcome. Taiwan is very active in the working groups in APEC and in advancing the agenda. So that presents one opportunity. There's another issue that I want to mention briefly, and that is, of course, the fact that both Taiwan and China have applied for membership in the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And now that the UK has joined, if they consider the applications in the order in which they were submitted, that means that China and Taiwan would be up next. There is no, of course, obligation for them to do so. But we do know, of course, that China and Taiwan basically joined the WTO at the same time. And so this is potentially another opportunity. There's no doubt in my mind that if China is accepted into the CPTPP and Taiwan is not accepted basically at the same time, that will be a missed opportunity and probably will not be another opportunity for Taiwan to join. So that's something that I think people should be paying attention to. And then I have a short question I really would like to ask Yu-Jie. I think I've been working myself on the issue of assurances when it comes to the question of how we strengthen deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And the question of assurances comes up, at least when I think about Taiwan's role in the United Nations. China is, and always has been, worried that Taiwan would use any participation in the UN to advance its claim to sovereignty, and worries that other countries, if they support Taiwan playing a bigger role, that this could erode China's sovereignty. So they view it as political. I think prior administrations in Taiwan have sometimes thought of this as advancing a political agenda, but certainly Tsai Ing-wen's administration has not. And I believe that regardless of who is elected in the election in January 24, that Taiwan will continue on a path of simply trying to boost its meaningful participation. So are there assurances that Taiwan or the US can provide to China to, and I know this is difficult, but how do we convince China that providing Taiwan with meaningful participation will not erode its own sovereignty claim, will not boost Taiwan's own claim to sovereignty, but will simply enable Taiwan to contribute to the United Nations and include its 23.5 million people in the UN?
Thank you, Bonnie. This is a very challenging issue, of course. The reason why the United States has this the so-called strategic ambiguity approach is exactly because it wants to assure the Beijing side and deter Taiwan from declaring Taiwan's independence or risking any move that would considered by Beijing as crossing Beijing's red line. So I really don't have a waterproof resolution to address this issue, but I would say that in my policy brief and in my personal experience, I believe that Taiwan should not use Taiwan's participation in international organizations to work on political posturing, to like appeal domestic voters. And we have to remember that Taiwan's voters are practical and they are wise, because as you look at the polls after polls, and also the referendums that former President Chen Shui-bian try to use to have the Taiwan public to say Taiwan is a state, to sort of make clear Taiwan's statehood in the referendums. They it failed, and also polls after polls show that Taiwan's voters understand the risks that come with such moves. So when asked about the status quo, and we all know what the status quo means in the Taiwan's context, which is to say we don't want to declare independence. We want to keep our de facto independence from China as we enjoy our democratic life. And the status quo is always the favorable option, is the option that the majority of Taiwan up to take over the years. And so I think one of the constraints for Taiwan's leadership, no matter whether it's the DPP or the KMT or a third party wins the next presidential election and legislative election in January 2024, their decision will inevitably be constrained by Taiwan's domestic voters who don't want to see a war. Nobody wants to see a war. And so I think that's something we need to keep in mind when thinking about what constrains Taiwan. Of course, the US government's policy and support also constrains Taiwan's political choices. But what really, and I want to take this opportunity to also emphasize Taiwan's agency, which is that Taiwan is a democracy run by our society, and voters' views matter, public opinion matters. And I think this will be a constraining factor. And I don't know whether this will assure Beijing, but it gives me more confidence that we will not be the provocative actor in an event of conflict. And I hope that it would never happen.
Yes. And with those thoughts, we also should be mindful of the fact that not only is Taiwan having an election next year, so is the United States. And the hope is that both Taipei and Washington understand the need to ensure the status quo, and to also ensure that Taiwan's space in international organizations and in the international community at large is preserved without, as Bonnie mentioned, leading to any provocation of China to take action, but rather to have that balance of reassuring China about the status of Taiwan, whilst at the same time ensuring that Taiwan's voice and best practices are shared with the world. So with that, I'm afraid the time has come for us to conclude this conversation. As Yu-Jie mentioned, her policy brief is available online below this particular web link. It's also available on the Wilson Center website at large. So I do hope that you will be able to look at that. Of course, Bonnie's paper is available on the German Marshall Fund, and her book is also available on Amazon and other book sellers as well. So with that, thank you both. Thank you, Yu-Jie, in particular, for making the time and commitment to join us here in Washington. And thank you, Bonnie, for always being willing and able to bolster the conversation, the robust conversation that we have regarding Taiwan and Washington today. So with that, thank you for logging in. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.